Actually, they were frozen solid.
Frozen solid.
They were frozen solid. So we tell them the story first, or just or wait until you? Okay. So the question was, there was a graduate student that was working on wood frogs in general, just in a zoology context, just things about wood frogs in general, life history, everything. And it was unclear, and still a little unclear, where they winter. Some frogs go to the lakes and swim around the lakes, some bury themselves in bogs, and it was unclear what wood frogs do. And so that was one of the things that she was looking at among many. And always one of the possibilities is that they dig down in the muck at the edge of the water and overwinter someplace down there. Well, they can't keep digging deeper because once, they're cold-blooded, so once they get stuck and start getting cold, they don't have movement anymore. So they either got to get down far enough to start with, or unlike mammals that can dig a little further if it gets a little colder. So the first whack at it, the first thing, it was we gathered up a bunch, took a square cage, went out and cut a big piece of sphagnum moss out of the area that we thought that they might be in this boggy areas at the edge of lakes. They live in the woods normally, up on the land. And we picked it all up and put it inside of our cage. And we put the wood frogs inside of there and then buried the whole thing back down in the place it came from, down deep enough that we thought they would be probably frozen, but it was, 18, 20 inches. And then the idea was several boxes would be lower down and to see if they actually could survive there, if that was a possibility for them to be there. And then of the several boxes, one we decided to dig up in the wintertime. So they were marked, went out there, dug it up with great difficulty because the whole thing was frozen. The bog is now frozen. Down through this box is frozen solid. And so chiseled it out, lifted the whole box up, and brought it into the lab in the middle of the wintertime. And indeed, some of the box was frozen. You poke at the moss and everything, it was frozen. And there were a couple of the frogs that were close to the side. And you could poke them, and they were hard. So we just brought the box in the middle of the afternoon, cold day like this, brought it in, set it over a drain in one of the labs, and left. And then I came back over checking labs late that night, 10, 11 o'clock. And here some of them had thawed out, and the ones closest had started to thaw out, and they were moving around, and one of them had crawled out of the hole of the box. And so it was essentially shown that, indeed, these guys froze and then recovered. No.
No?
No, that's okay. Once you ask your question.
Had anyone hypothesized this before you came up with it?
No, because it was assumed that amphibians couldn't really freeze all the way. If they got frozen, then they weren't going to survive. That they had to get in water or marsh or someplace, and so it was a shock that it was actually there.
So when you all when you dug these up, was it your expectation that these frogs would be dead?
It was our expectations that the shallower ones would probably be dead, that the deeper ones someplace would be okay. And actually, we weren't sure how much of this bog froze all the way through, because we dreamed this up in the fall. And so we were guessing that if we put them down about this far, maybe these bogs are okay there. And then further down, they indeed were okay, because we put them in several areas, closer to the water and then also deeper. And so we were assuming that at some place there would be a soft spot. And indeed there was, but when we dug up the shallow box in the middle of winter, then that was what we were trying to see. Was it frozen in that spot?
So did some of the ones that you buried deeper not freeze at all? So they didn't have to go through
There, at one point, we had finally got far enough that there were some of the sphagnum bog didn't freeze. So, yeah, and that would be varied every winter. You know, depending on the winter and how much snow, you know, it would be further down or up. But yeah, we did have one that wasn't frozen all the way. So, you know, it's still possible if you got deep enough out there, you would always be below the frost line.
Would you want to tell us where this took place?
This was at in Itasca Park, just out on the point, just past the big cabin there. You know where the big cabin is. So, and this was at a sphagnum bog just at the edge of the lake. And it was Dr. Susie Coyner that did the original work there. And then so that part was done, and she went ahead and did a little bit of work on that, but didn't refine it. I mean, didn't really figure out how you could get the frogs to freeze. And she finished her PhD and went off to teach, and it was Bill Schmid then that you're going to go interview that worked on the mechanisms and then how they have to be cooled slowly, and the mechanism that finally allows them to freeze up under what conditions those do, and then actually repeated it enough times to figure out, yeah, they really do freeze. It wasn't a fluke. And so he and some other graduate students worked on doing that work.
So do you think you were the first person to witness this?
You know, I'm sure that people probably had witnessed it some places but didn't realize that they could come back. So I'm sure somebody dug up frozen frogs before. I don't know. I mean, maybe they just didn't think about it. Maybe they were cool and thawed out some before you knew they were really frozen and never thawed before you found them.
So do they know how they're able to freeze and like stay alive during the winter without a heartbeat or like blood circulation?
Yeah, it's like all the other animals. When they're cold like that, they use almost no energy. So they can remove everything outside. Their cell metabolism really drops down. And they really don't need to, if you're not metabolizing, you don't need much oxygen. And you can absorb what little you need through the skin or whatever. But so essentially all the metabolism stops, and they like insects, they can go in this dormant stage.
When you saw the frog thawing out, did you automatically like call someone and start doing tests on it, or?
You know, I can't remember now. I think Susie had gone home. I think that was the thing, because we were clear up at Itasca, and she was a graduate student, so she had come up for the weekend or something, and this was on. I think she had actually left, so I called her up and told her that her frogs were, because we just assumed that we got this big block that all froze. That one's a wash, and we were essentially just brought it in to kind of, you know, because it's just this big ugly chunk of mud and ice and metal. You know, and you've been out there for a few hours, you can imagine it's down so far and it's all solid, and you're out there with axes and chipping at it for all afternoon trying to dig it out. You just brought it in and set it in there and said, well, that one didn't work, let's go home.
So did you pull up the other ones?
No, the other ones weren't pulled up until spring.
They weren't.
And I don't really remember whether she worked out whether they winter. You know, I just don't remember that. It's been long enough ago. I don't remember now her finished work and see if she really figured out where they. I kind of think that they didn't ever really figure it out, but there's a bunch of them go back to the lake, and so I think they're but you don't see them in the lake.
I've read some sources that say that the glucose that the frog produces keeps the cells from freezing completely, but you were saying they were actually frozen.
Well, they could actually be the cells that would not be frozen inside of the little cell. I mean, that's different than if you poke at it and everything around the outside of the cells is hard and the skin is hard. And if the water has been removed outside of the cells and what little is there is in between in the interstitial fluid, and the animal will still be hard and frozen that way. But the stuff inside the cells really can't freeze. You're right, because those water crystals would start breaking things up in the cell. So it has to get out, or has to have enough antifreeze in there, glucose or anything else inside of them, to keep it from breaking up.
Let me add also that if you reduce the amount of water in the cells, then that actually lowers the freezing point of what's in the cells. So they can supercool without freezing. And then the ice on the outside of the cells actually serves as an insulator around the tissues themselves. But the tissues they have been shown not to actually freeze.
Yeah, the tissue can't freeze because it'll be destroyed. So you can understand why when you move the water out, then that means that the concentration of everything else is increased because the water is gone, and when you have increased concentration, then you lower the freezing point.
Okay, so I heard that the wood frogs, after a -6 degrees Celsius, they will die if it's colder. So do you ever monitor the temperature of the ground when you pull the ice block out?
No, we did not, because where we were working then when we pulled it out was it was solid. It was cold. I mean, it was a frozen block of sphagnum moss.
Was the bog itself snow-covered?
The bog was snow covered, but not very much that year. See, that's one of the reasons we even put them at that shallow depth. We assumed that down inside this bog with snow cover, that lots of the bog wouldn't freeze. And indeed, oftentimes you can go out and with just a little crust over the bog. If you dug down in there, the bogs won't be frozen because there's maybe some bog grasses up on top and stuff, or sphagnum that's not solid, but the living stuff, and so it's kind of fuzzy, and that's an insulation. And then you get some snow on it, and then you just don't freeze very far, and nobody's stepping on it, compacting it. And so we assumed that most of it didn't freeze, and so that's why the reason one of the boxes was so shallow, because we assumed most of it would freeze. Well, that winter, it did. Now, that's not to say it always at that winter, that shallow a depth, and because I kind of suspect that most winters that winter probably was not frozen there.
Anyone else? That's it? One more?
Yep.
Have you heard of cryopreservation?
Yes, for people.
Yeah, for people.
Yes,
And
I've heard of it.
Did anyone that you worked with, or did you ever kind of make the connection right away that could have been?
No, because people have been selling the idea that you can be frozen and brought back to life for a long time, and you can be. I mean, there are people that will freeze you and bring you back, and I think it's a good business to get into because nobody's going to come back and collect them, I don't think. But no, it doesn't make sense that mammals could do that. It's surprising that even amphibians do it. But by then already people are figuring out that insects could do it. I mean, that's been now 20 years ago, but they were figuring out insects could do it. Weren't sure that amphibians could do it, but it's pretty certain that mammals won't be. Well, at least at today's technology they can't be. I can't say that they'll never be able to.
So that wasn't the first time that they discovered?
No, there have been people talking about that for a long time. And certainly, some things have been frozen for a long time. I mean, the sperm been frozen for a long time. Artificial breeders have been freezing sperm for the cattle and things for a great deal of time, but that's quite different than a full organism.